Chapter 2 Revelation. Daybreak came gently, a soft haze of morning mist stirring around the party's ankles as each person went about their daily rituals. Inside the relative privacy of his tent, Simon combed pomade and a touch of oil of vanilla through his hair, primping again and again before finally sighing quietly in resignation. He'd never be able to smooth the back down just right with only a tiny signal mirror and the reflection and a dagger to style by. Oh, what he wouldn't give to have his valet here. What he wouldn't give to be home. Not the townhouse in the upper city where he'd been taken from, though. Really home at Silver Spring, nestled in his bed, the sound of little feet pattering down the hall outside, chased by a nurse trying to wrestle Vladimir into his trousers. "The young master cannot take breakfast in his small clothes. What would the Dowager Baroness say?" He reached up to gently clutch the locket hanging around his neck, the tiny delicate portrait of his son inside, always by his heart. He couldn't return. Not with an illithid tadpole writhing around in his skull, waiting for the moment when it would finally burst out of his face, shedding him like Mortimer shed skins. Raising his mirror once again, he carefully adjusted the collar of his shirt to fully expose the two angry little wounds on his neck. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure why he thought the wounds would be gone in the morning. After all, Astarians were quite obvious, scarred and vicious. How had any of them explained those bite marks away? He cautiously tipped a few drops of bright red healing elixir onto the corner of a rag and daubed at the puncture marks, wincing as they closed around what had already begun healing naturally. It was only a few moments before they were nothing more than a patch of irritated skin, no sign of any illicit hematophagy. Satisfied, Simon continued dressing himself for the day. What a chore. "Good morning," Gale called, far too chipper for the hour and unusually sober as Simon exited his tent. "I was just about to attempt to make these goblin trail rations something akin to edible." "Morning, Gale," Simon replied, offering a quick nod of the head in deference to the Archmage. It was still a wonder that for the past few days he'd been encamped with such a prestigious fellow. It was a conscious effort on his part to refer to him not as Sage Dicarios, but merely Gale, as he'd insisted, both inebriated and sober. "We're certain those rations aren't, long pork, correct?" Simon smiled, though he eyed the meat suspiciously. "Positively identified as rabbit," Gale smiled, "though also positively identified as raw and very poorly seasoned," he added. "Given what you've managed to produce out here on the trail thus far, I'm sure it will be magnificent," Simon smiled, tucking his hands into the small of his back and standing straight. "I have already borrowed a bit of that ithbank you managed to procure for the preparation. I hope you don't mind." "Are you feeling all right?" Gale asked, his brow furrowing slightly. "You seem to have a touch more pallor to you than usual." "I can't say I know what you mean, sir," Simon replied, a moment too quickly. Best have our resident cleric give you a once-over. Given our situation, it's best to know if it's the result of a spot of mouldy cheese or something a little squirmier that's got you under the weather. Perhaps avoid Lae'zel while we're diagnosing as well," he added quietly. "She's been sleeping with a dagger in hand, you know. When she does sleep, muttering about Gake at all hours." "I will certainly keep that in mind." Simon nodded, his gaze flicking over to her tent. At the moment it appeared she was performing some well-honed routine of athleticism, hefting herself repeatedly, chin first, into the branches of a nearby tree, with her pack, which appeared to be near to bursting with river rocks, squeezed between her thighs. Karlach, for her part, was nearby offering words of encouragement, which at the very least seemed to be holding Lae'zel's attention far more than two wizards whispering. He strode across camp, doing his best to maintain an appearance of confidence and calm. Shadowheart kept her tent a little farther apart than the others, and he knew from the days prior that unlike most clerics, she offered her devotion in the evenings, or before the break of dawn. He'd be lying if he said he was surprised, given that she offered him the name Shadowheart to begin with. More of a title than a name. She must be a worshipper of one of the darker deities in the pantheon, although there was certainly a logical limit to how dark a god she could serve. They were all still alive, after all, so probably not Baal at the very least. Small comforts. As Simon approached, he could see her fiddling with the artifact she'd been carrying since the nautiloid. It appeared as if she was trying to pry one of the faces of the object free, and was having no luck with her bare hands, swearing softly under her breath. "Good morning, Shadowheart," Simon said. Shadowheart jumped slightly at the intrusion, but regained her composure quickly. "Can't bear the anticipation any longer." "It's none of your business," she said, stowing the artifact once again. "Perhaps it's some sort of puzzle. Each of the faces has a different symbol from what I've seen," Simon offered. "I never cared for puzzles," Shadowheart huffed, "so I certainly hope that's not the case." "I thought you liked mystery," Simon smirked. "Mysteries have meaning, even in just the solving of them," Shadowheart replied, crossing her arms. "There's a purpose. Puzzles are just jokes or pranks, but far too drawn out for any comedy to remain." "A semantic discrepancy I doubt we'll be able to hash out without even breakfast in our bellies," Simon said, offering a polite smile. "Indeed. Did you want something?" she asked, brushing her braid over her shoulder in a display of disinterest at ever hashing out something that seemed so simple. Wizards. Yes. I don't suppose you have any way of gauging how bad our, condition is?" he asked, folding his hands to avoid wringing them nervously. He searched Shadowheart's face for any hint of divine inspiration, but found none. "It's bad," she said firmly, as if speaking to an idiot. "Well, you said they're burning fuses. Any indication of how much fuse is left?" Simon asked again, trying not to pout. "Let's just assume, for the sake of expediency, that it is bad, and it's only going to get worse. That way, if it doesn't, we can be pleasantly surprised." The pessimist in me appreciates the suggestion, but the pragmatist must know if certain avenues of investigation are cut off. "Would we have time to inquire with other wizards in Waterdeep?" he asked, gesturing back in Gale's direction. "Neverwinter? Evereska? Can we afford to investigate multiple avenues for a cure? Lae'zel seems adamant about getting to a Githyanki creche, but you're equally adamant about getting to Baldur's Gate. Knowing if we have a matter of weeks, days, or hours would be of great help." "Well, you do know my preference," Shadowheart said, wrinkling her nose at the mention of the Gith. "But you make a good point. Searching out multiple possibilities does seem wisest. I've got no idea how we'd gauge how far along our infection is, though. Can't say I have much experience in this field. And if I did once, I don't remember." Simon rubbed his chin in contemplation, his brow furrowed. "I hate to say it, as we do have strength in numbers, but it might be beneficial to split up and pursue some of these leads on occasion. Send small, lightweight groups on more pressing matters, while the rest hold down the fort. Scout ahead, find new leads, that sort of thing." "Sounds logical. But why are you bringing this up with me?" Shadowheart asked, raising a brow. "I value your input," Simon replied simply and clearly. "I plan on checking the temperature with everyone on this topic, of course." "Well, as long as we are moving forward, I'm with you," she said, a hint of a smile creeping into her eyes. "Can I ask you something?" Simon asked quickly, leaning in conspiratorially. "You're on a roll now. I expect I can't stop you," Shadowheart replied, smirking a bit. "Does anyone seem off to you?" "How can I possibly gauge that? On top of knowing you all for not even 2 days, we've all got mind flayer tadpoles in our heads." "All right, let's choose someone at random. Take Astarion. Doesn't he seem like something more is going on?" Simon asked, watching Shadowheart carefully. He didn't want to be the one to reveal Astarion's secret. But honestly, how much of a secret was it? He couldn't be the only one who knew just because he was the only one who had experienced the truth firsthand. Could he? I think I like conspiracy theorist gossip, Simon. "All right. What are you thinking?" she asked, leaning in with a more genuine, if somewhat mean-spirited smile as she sought secrets and rumors. He's almost certainly lying about his identity, Simon murmured. There's no magistrate by his name in Baldur's Gate. You sound very confident in that. It's a nobleman's job to keep track of other nobles and gentry. I've never met the man until the other day on the trail. What do you think? Shadowheart jutted her hip out and gazed across the camp, arms crossed in consideration. Simon was strongly reminded of the sharp-tongued fashion mavens who wrote scathing editorials throughout the social season, their keen eyes catching everything from gowns worn on 2 separate occasions and popped seams to suspiciously rounded bellies on women whose husbands had been away. Pale skin, red eyes, white hair, she mused. Could be at Zarkai. Simon blinked. Beg pardon? Zarkai, an albino drow, Shadowheart replied. Elite spies and assassins for the Underdark, sent to infiltrate the surface world. They look just like any other elf similarly afflicted with albinism, so they blend in. Disguise themselves as respectable members of society so they can gather intelligence and return it to their matrons. You seem to know an awful lot about this, Simon remarked, raising a brow. Someone has to, she smirked. Secrets and stealth are something of a specialty of mine. Is this a personal interest or related to your holy orders? Nice try. In any case, if he was sent to the surface to spy in Baldur's Gate, he would have a completely fabricated identity. Might explain the gap in your knowledge. Or perhaps you're just not as well informed as you think. Perhaps, but unlikely. I've personally hosted my house's balls and soirees for over 30 years, and been in attendance for a further 15 before that. I've rubbed elbows with the patriarchs and gentry just as much as the landed nobility outside the city. There's not a man, woman, or person with title and rank I've not met, from the mouth of the Chionthar to Cormyr. Human, elf, dwarf, even some particularly distinguished halflings. And no Ancunians among them. Is that his name? You've gotten farther than I have. My dear, nobles are only all too happy to give one another their names, but feel titles should be sufficient for the common folk. Is that so? And that makes you? Baron Fontdale, at your service, Miss Shadowheart. Simon grinned, giving an exaggerated bow. So I'm common folk to you, then? She asked, raising a brow. Well, you can't remember otherwise, and I can't say I recall otherwise either. Unless you think this worm has eaten 2 holes in my brain already, and that those holes belong to people who are conveniently in this camp. Simon was bluffing. After all, there were a possible 3 holes, but he wasn't about to mention the 3rd. He hadn't discussed much of the past with Will yet, though according to him that past would soon be catching up to their camp, one way or another. Touché. The missing memories isn't rare around here in particular, is it? A fine riposte, madame. With that I shall take my leave. Simon smiled. Gale is preparing rabbit for breakfast. I hope to see you there. The morning mist had burned off everywhere except over the river itself by the time Simon approached Astarion's tent, his heart beating a little faster. What was this going to be? A confrontation? He certainly hoped not. Shkaketh! Lae'zel spat. Someone has been touching my possessions. Oh dear, I wonder who that could have been, Astarion remarked, his high tone carrying easily through the camp. Lae'zel's gaze narrowed dangerously, and she crossed the space to Astarion with large, threatening steps. Apparently she was not similarly concerned with avoiding confrontation. You were on a double watch last night. The rest of us were asleep for 4 hours. Convenient for a thief. My dear, let's be rational, Astarion began. If I had stolen anything, it would be foolish of me to remain in a camp filled with dangerous people with sharp blades, would it not? Secondly, you too were on a watch last night, as was Will. Responsibility for security of goods and property is equally shared across all watch parties until the time of a crime can be confirmed, if there is indeed a crime. Finally, I don't know if Gith have such a concept, but I am a man of the law by profession, and accusing us of criminality and corruption, while a popular pastime, is not considered acceptable among polite circles. We do have such a concept, but your logic is flawed, your evidence lacking. You offer no alibi, Only deflections. And you offer no proof of wrongdoing. Merely suspicions, allegations, and innuendo. Come back with evidence if you wish to accuse me, Astarion sniffed. Kachaki! Lae'zel spat, turning on her heel and marching for Will with an intent that bordered on murderous. Astarion noted Simon's approach immediately, a bit of tension in his frame. Whether from worry about the previous confrontation or the next, he couldn't be certain. He let out a huff of breath as if trying to reset after the previous conversation. Good morning, my lord, he said, his tone oddly soft and subtle, trying not to draw attention to their conversation after the dust-up before. It was quite a pleasant sound, Simon decided. How are you feeling? You're not the first person to ask me that today, Simon replied, self-consciously reaching up for his collar. I do feel a little lightheaded. It will pass, Astarion said with reassuring confidence. Just be glad that I'm not a true vampire. A bite from one of them and you might wake up as a vampire's spawn, like my good self. All of a vampire's hunger, but few of their powers, he explained. Is that why you can stand sunlight? Because you're not a true vampire? Simon asked, suddenly unsure of everything he had ever read on the subject of vampirism. Oh no, I should be cinders in this light. I hadn't seen the sun for 200 years before we crashed here. Someone, or something, he added with a significant look, wants me alive. They've changed the rules. The tadpoles have that much power? Simon asked, his eyes widening. So it would seem. Standing in the sun, wading through a river, wandering into homes without an invitation. They're all perfectly mundane activities now. Hang on, how do you know you can enter homes without an invitation? Oh, didn't you hear? I snuck into everyone's tents last night just to give them a quick rummage, he replied, giving his haughty little giggle. Simon couldn't be sure if he was joking or not with a tone like that. As for my other quirks, well, we can figure those out in time, he smirked. Apparently there are quite a few quirks that come with these tadpoles. Will and I have both noticed a diminution of our abilities, while you seem to be experiencing an expansion of yours. And just last night, Gale and Lae'zel were remarking on how none of us are showing any of the usual symptoms of seromorphosis. As far as I'm concerned, we're all in this together, for better or worse. Panic will do no one any good. We must keep a cool head and try to turn any unforeseen situations to our advantage, Simon said, giving Astarion a long, pointed look. I'm just glad you're being sensible about these revelations. I was worried people might turn up with torches and pitchforks, he said, an uneasy smile on his lips as his focus flicked behind Simon. Although there's still time. Well, that was not the conversation I thought I was going to be overhearing this morning, Will said, frowning as he looked between Simon and Astarion. A bloody vampire in our camp. You knew, Shadowheart said, frowning at Simon. You knew and you didn't share. You just let me wildly speculate. Well, I wanted to hear your wild speculation. And you would have thought me an idiot had I seriously suggested he was a vampire who can walk in the sun, pass through running water, and sleep outside a coffin, Simon reasoned. I must admit a bit of curiosity. What were these wild speculations? Astarion asked, raising a brow. I merely suggested you were a liar and a con man, while Shadowheart postulated drow ancestry on top of it. Sarkai, Will nodded. Reasonable assumption, though I'm not sure which I'd prefer. Simon's brow furrowed. How did everyone have that word on their tongue except him? Guess the mosquitoes next to the river are bigger, aren't they? Karlach chuckled. For the record, Astarion, I taste absolutely awful, Gale declared. How would you know? Karlach asked, amused. You see all this colour? Aposematic, my dear. Just take my word for it, Gale advised. Guess I'll have to, because I got no idea what you just said. Karlach shook her head. Anyway, I think we're probably one of the best equipped groups to handle a single vampire in our midst, if things ever get out of hand. I know what a stake will do, now imagine it on fire, she said, the jesting tone draining slightly from her words as she gave Astarion a serious look. It's not going to get out of hand, Simon stated, turning back to Astarion. Is it? He told rather than asked. "Of course. I'll keep my teeth to myself. Vampires tend to be sticklers about invitations," he said. Simon was almost impressed with how casually he lied. "Now shall we go? We've a long day ahead of us."